Welcome everyone once again to the Tales from the Economicon. I'm your host, the Economancer, the High Priest of the Economicon. Today we're going to be talking about two things that may not make any sense together: cybernetics and corruption. So what does cybernetics and corruption have to do with each other? First, you have to understand that cybernetics doesn't necessarily just mean something to do with robots. It's actually an interdisciplinary approach in systems. So Talcott Parsons was actually one of the first drivers of cybernetics within social systems, and it was picked up later by Nicholas Luhmann as well as a few others who've kind of looked at economics or other social sciences, sociology, psychology, social psychology in this form of cybernetics. Now, I'm not going to do an intro into cybernetics or anything like that. This is going to be a high-level view of some of my ideas behind corruption and cybernetics. So, let's get into it. So, corruption exists across domains or subsystems, right? But it is not a meta system. So corruption is also further disaggregated by culture or the society at hand, which provides further problems identifying and dealing with reproduction through recursion. However, if we identify separately as a crime, we've done that before, then it can be treated the same way. But this begs the question, and it is my contention that corruption is a communicated parasite. Unlike other communications in the social systems, corruption distorts the signals of further communications, for example, the price signal and market valuations. So despite the operationally closed system of economic to the political, as the mediums of exchange differ, corruption acts as a noise signal and works as a multi-system perturber due to being structurally coupled with political systems. So to address some of the issues, we need to look at second-order cybernetics, downward causation, and constructivism. All right, so some of my main theses here. This is all going to be interconnected. One of the major issues for transitioning economies from a centrally planned to a market-based economy is expectations. So expectations do not shift with the shifting of the economic system. So this means that it's harder to unlearn something than it is to learn something. So like a perfect example of this is the expectation of government or organizations in providing items, planning, and this leads to further the lack of awareness for the necessity of risk. When you go from a centrally planned to a market-based economy, you kind of don't realize the necessity of risk or how we should socialize risk. And so we can think of this in a few ways. We have recursive communication, mimetic isomorphism, which is just another way of saying imitation, competitive exclusion, and systemic differentiation, which means the systems within themselves become different enough, much the way we look at the division of labor, we have a division of systems, so they differentiate from each other, even though there could be one binding system. As time goes on and complexity increases, that system has to differentiate itself from other parts of the system, which gives us subsystems. So we can think of systems from an institutional or an ecological basis. My contention is that of an ecological approach. However, I find that there are two actors in a system. So the institutional is associated with the mimetic isomorphism, and then the ecological approach is with that competitive exclusion, right? So in the way I'm looking at it, I find that there are two actors in the system, much like a country's growth path, right? Some countries, like China, will follow an imitative path. This is the mimetic isomorphism, and others will follow a trail of competitive exclusion, such as the United States. What this entails is that there is an evolutionary process that necessitates competition for individual selection, but imitation becomes a group selective process. Thus, we have multi-level selection. This gives rise to different selections and spillover patterns that may also be changed by spatial and government perturbations, such as moving from California to Texas. The tech cluster in California is facing an increasing budget constraint, but the benefits from the tacit knowledge spillovers tend to give it, a greater access. However, tacit knowledge spillovers follow a life cycle where young formative industries have more concentration spatially, as tacit knowledge is significant in innovation. And that's also true for growth industries, where tacit knowledge still accounts for the majority of innovation. Still, mature and declining industries primarily rely on research and development and articulable knowledge. Thus, we have a necessary and functional condition for multi-level selection through economic processes. This phenomenon validates Schumpeter, Parsons, and Luhmann. Now, the role of recursive communication is essentially clustering. So clustering is functionally a recursive process or reflexive process, depending on your preferred jargon, which leads me to my most profound idea. So let me explain this. The discoveries of social science do not remain discoveries for long, because their discovery manipulates or perturbs other systems. So the education or social science subsystem perturbs the economic and political system as the recursive communications become incorporated into the life and familiar principles of social life. Therefore, we have this idea that the social scientist introduces meaning associated with a particular context of social life to those in other subsystems. So, last is the emergent properties in systems. Emergent properties, or properties that manifest themselves as a result of various system components working together, not as an individual component. Once again, clustering is an emergent property, as is the price system, coordinating decisions and information throughout the economy, and even division of labor is an emergent property. So in this, corruption is an emergent property of the political system to allocate resources that are economic or otherwise. That given it being a multi-level model of selection, corruption can be addressed as an emergent property, and that the recursive communications causally influence and shape huge human agency, leading to this paradox of perceptions and incentives. And so my most inflammatory conclusion about anti-corruption is that none of the models that we've gone over so far deal with the fundamental problem of corruption, and this is due to the ideological or perceptual bias. Since no consensus is reached for downward causation, which means those at the top influence those at the bottom, the phenomenon will continue. But my idea for a possible solution is to make corruption transparent. Now, I know everybody talks about corruption through transparency by exposition or exposing it, but I am going to try. Well, I wouldn't say the model that I'm representing would expose it by attempting to locate or identify systemic failures in different subsystems. So this would be law, politics, economics, science, education, and the reconstitution of social rules, that latent pattern maintenance, that deal directly with corruption. And this would limit the noise signaling process across systems. Because one of the major problems is that when we have so many different ideas being talked about, we're having this noise signaling process that doesn't allow for a central, downward causation creating institution, right? We don't have that. So what this would entail is something like pressuring or increasing the pressure on petty corruption through harsher punishment. And then there's an increasing discourse on all forms of corruption, not as incidents, but as properties of the political system specifically, which would, alleviate some of the problems of this biasness. So you couldn't use your political party as a hammer under the notion of corruption by changing what you may define as corruption, because it would be solidified and it would make total sense to everyone within the discourse. So this recursive communication could build, and then that would help fundamentally change our perception of it. And so, and the last thing that would make this matter is because it would limit the fundamental problems in the medium of exchange. Because even though those medium of exchanges are different, they can still be manipulated. You can still have some transfer from one system to another through perturbations and even through some medium of exchange that may be there, right? So like, you know, we've had this idea about, you know, being able to buy and bribe your constituency to vote for you through different policies. But we're going to try to end that. And that comes through, again, this increased transparency by labeling things as such. And again, we're building on top of this recursive communication. And I think once we do that, it would increase the difficulty of exchange from one subsystem to another. And I think that's ultimately the goal and what I think would be best in dealing with corruption. Now, I know a lot of the terms and a lot of the things that I've gone through may seem abstract. And eventually I'll probably put together a video where I go through some of these ideas in cybernetics, as well as like maybe multi-level selection and different types of processes, downward causation, that's, you know, another part, emergent properties. These are all very fundamental things that came from Hayek, as well as, you know, there were others, you know, Karl Popper had some of this in his work, Nicholas Luhmann, you have the neo-functional representations, and then the social systems theory. All of this kind of gets tossed together and looked at. And so down below, there's going to be a large amount of information to go through and read if you would so choose. And I implore you to, because it's a lot of good information that opens up a lot of these discussions. And even many of these discussions may not fall in my political sphere, but I think that they are there. And they're useful for us to learn and know, whether we're laymen or whether we're academics. And so with that being said, I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, like, share, subscribe, send it to someone, see what they think. They're probably going to be like, what is this guy talking about when it comes to cybernetics and corruption? But at the end of the day, I think it's a fantastic idea. I think it's something that we can all take something from. So yeah. Shoot down some comments down below, because that's going to, you know, beat back this algorithm. So we're going to beat this algorithm with cybernetics. And I hope you have a wonderful day. And thank you for taking a walk with me through the Economicon.